There is a lyric that defined the 1980s. You know it. You sang it. I'm gonna live forever. It was the anthem of a generation that believed fame was the cure for everything. And the face of that anthem, the raw, sweating, electrifying spirit of that dream, was Gene Anthony Ray. To the world, he was Leroy Johnson, the kid from the streets who didn't need ballet shoes to conquer the school of performing arts. He was the breakout star of the phenomenon called fame. He was the reason millions of kids in suburban America tried to do the splits in their living rooms. He was magic. But here is the brutal irony that history has tried to forget. The boy who sang about living forever died at 41. He didn't die on a red carpet. He didn't die surrounded by applause. He died broke, his body ravaged by a virus that the world was too scared to name, his legacy buried under sensational headlines about drugs arrests and madness. Let's cut straight to it. Some people walk into fame, others climb into it. But Gene Anthony Ray, he detonated. Before the world knew his name, there was a skinny kid in Harlem who danced like the ground owed him respect. A kid who didn't take ballet, didn't take jazz, didn't take a single formal lesson because he didn't need them. Rhythm lived in his blood. Fire lived in his eyes. And trouble lived all around him. Hollywood fell in love with his authenticity. They loved the street attitude. They loved the danger he brought to the screen. But here is the truth. They never told you Hollywood didn't know what to do with a black boy like that when the cameras stopped rolling. He was too raw, too real, too uncontrollable. So they labeled him the illiterate ghetto dancer, the stereotype they felt safe with, even when he was sharper, more sensitive, and more fragile than anyone dared to admit. While America cheered for him on Thursday nights, his real life was burning literally. A new house torched in a white neighborhood, his entire family swallowed by a massive drug bust, producers terrified of his temper, directors whispering behind his back. The same system that exploited his street image for ratings was quietly building the cage that would destroy him. Gene was a star, but he was also a storm, and storms don't last forever. This isn't the pretty version of his story. This isn't the sanitized Hollywood recap with a happy ending. This is the truth about a gifted black dancer who took over the world and then watched it collapse right under his feet. From the block parties of Harlem to the sold-out arenas of London, and finally to the silence of the end. This is the story of Gene Anthony Ray. Let's start from the beginning. Because once you understand where Gene came from, you'll understand why he could never truly escape where he was going. Gene Anthony Ray was born in Harlem on May 24, 1962. To the world, he would become a star. But to his family, he was just Tony. Harlem in those days was a symphony of sirens and soul music. It wasn't an easy place. It was a battlefield of poverty drugs and the constant hum of danger. But for Tony, the noise of the street wasn't something to fear. It was a rhythm to move to. Even before he could tie his shoes, people could feel something in him, something sharp, something bright, something you couldn't teach. He was only a toddler when a local newspaper printed a picture of him dancing, twisting his little body with the kind of confidence grown men spend their whole lives trying to find. Nobody told him to perform. He just did. Because for Tony, movement wasn't an activity. It was oxygen. While other future stars were taking expensive ballet lessons in climate-controlled studios, learning French terms like plié and pirouette, Gene was learning on the asphalt. He didn't have technique. He had instinct. He didn't count steps. He felt the beat. New York was a battlefield of dance crews, borough against borough, block against block, and Tony showed up ready. There is a misconception that male dancers are soft. Gene shattered that myth. He grew up fighting sometimes because he had to, sometimes because he wanted to. When boys on the block teased him for rolling with the girls to dance, he handled it quickly and fiercely. People learned not to underestimate the pretty boy with the braids and the smile. He wasn't soft. He wasn't scared. He was built from Harlem steel. His family, loud, complicated, and deeply connected to the streets, saw his talent not just as a hobby, but as a life raft. They guarded him. They pointed him towards something brighter than the corners they knew too well. But Gene was not an academic. He was accepted into the High School of Performing Arts, the very school that fame would later immortalize, but he didn't last. He was kicked out after 1 year. Why? Because you cannot put a storm in a jar. He didn't fit into the discipline of a classroom. He slapped a teacher. He rebelled. He was too wild for the institution. He was back on the streets. It seemed like his chance was over. But fate has a funny way of circling back. In 1979, Hollywood came to New York looking for kids to cast in a movie called Hot Lunch, which would later be renamed Fame. Thousands of kids lined up. Gene wasn't there. He missed the audition. But a few days later, his friends who had been cast told him to show up anyway. Just come. Just try. Just dance. He skipped school. He walked into that studio with nothing prepared. He didn't have a headshot. He didn't have a resume. He barely had an attitude that said he wanted to be there. The director, Alan Parker, was looking for a lead role, a character named Leroy Johnson. The script described Leroy as unpolished, angry, brilliant, and illiterate. When Gene walked into the room, the producers stopped breathing. He didn't just read the lines. He spat them out with a raw, authentic aggression that no acting school could teach. And when he danced, it was like watching a live wire snap. Alan Parker realized something immediately. Leroy Johnson wasn't a character he had to write anymore. He was standing right in front of him. Gene didn't get the role because he was the best actor. He got the role because he wasn't acting at all. Leroy Johnson wasn't written for Gene Anthony Ray. Gene Anthony Ray created him, and Hollywood had just met a force it could not control. When Fame hit the theaters in 1980, Gene Anthony Ray didn't just become famous, he became inevitable. The moment he stepped into the frame as Leroy Johnson, audiences felt something they had never seen before on a Hollywood screen. A black kid from Harlem who danced with the kind of honesty that could not be choreographed. He wasn't polished. He wasn't restrained. He wasn't shaped into Hollywood's safe idea of perfection. He was real. He was a spark straight from the asphalt. And America couldn't look away. Teenagers flooded theaters. Girls screamed his name. Boys in the suburbs tried to copy his moves, only to learn that the rhythm in Gene's body wasn't imitation material. It was a gift from God. While other actors in the film were playing roles, Gene was simply vibrating. He was the id of the movie, the raw, untamed energy that drove the whole machine. When the film was turned into a television series in 1982, most of the original cast was replaced. But the producers knew one thing: you cannot replace Leroy. Gene was the only major lead brought over to the TV show. He was the pulse. He was the dangerous element that made a sanitized TV drama feel alive. The cast moved to Los Angeles to film. For a young man who had never really left Harlem, the shift was surreal. Suddenly, he was walking onto sets built like cities. He was driving expensive cars. He was the king of MGM Studios. But the real shock didn't happen in America. It happened across the ocean. In the United Kingdom, Fame wasn't just a TV show. It was a religion. When the cast flew to London for a tour, they stepped off the plane into full-blown hysteria. Reporters compared the crowds to the early days of Beatlemania. Gene couldn't walk down the street without being swarmed. He wasn't just a dancer anymore. He was a global sex symbol. He was a fashion icon. His cut-off shirts and leg warmers defined the look of the decade. Fan letters poured in thousands upon thousands every single day. He had to hire 2 secretaries just to open the envelopes. He was 20 years old, and he had the world at his feet. He was performing in sold-out stadiums, singing, dancing, living the lyrics he helped make famous. I'm gonna live forever. In those moments under those blinding stage lights, it felt true. But success is never a clean blessing, especially when you are a storm. Behind the scenes, the uncontrollable nature that made him a star began to worry the people in charge. Debbie Allen, the show's choreographer and star, adored him. She saw his genius, but even she had to constantly fight to keep him on track. Gene didn't understand call times. He didn't understand authority. If he didn't want to rehearse, he didn't rehearse. If he was angry, he exploded. His temper flared often. Directors began to whisper that he was difficult, and fame magnified everything. The highs, the lows, the insecurities. The rumors started. People dissected his mannerisms. They whispered about his sexuality. Was he gay? Was he straight? Gene refused to answer. He didn't filter himself for anyone. That was both his beauty and his curse. He was making money, more money than anyone in his family had ever seen. But he wasn't keeping it. He was spending it. He was giving it away. He was trying to be the savior for everyone back in Harlem. And just as he was standing at the absolute peak of his powers, the ground beneath him began to shift. The show was canceled by NBC, then picked up for syndication. The machine was slowing down. And the demons he left behind in New York, they were tired of waiting. They were coming to collect. To understand why Gene Anthony Ray fell, you have to understand who he was carrying. Gene wasn't just a 21-year-old superstar living in Hollywood. He was the sole financial engine for a massive, complicated family back in New York. He wasn't just buying cars for himself. He was paying rent, buying food, and solving problems for aunts, uncles, cousins, and friends. He was the golden child, the one who made it out. And when you are the one who makes it out, you don't just leave. You are expected to reach back and pull everyone else up with you. But the weight was becoming crushing. The cast of Fame was famous, yes. But they weren't paid like movie stars. They were paid like television workers. Gene was rich compared to Harlem, but he wasn't wealthy enough to fix the systemic problems of his neighborhood. And then, in 1984, the roof caved in. Police raided his family's home in New York. It wasn't a small bust. It was a headline event. His mother, Jean Ray, the woman he loved more than anyone in the world, the woman who had pushed him to dance, was arrested. She was charged with selling heroin and cocaine to undercover officers. His grandmother, Viola Ward, was arrested. Police found cocaine and a .38 caliber pistol in her possession. The headlines were brutal. They didn't just say, John Ray arrested. They screamed, Fame star's mother in drug ring. Gene wasn't even in the house when it happened. He was never charged with a crime. But in the court of public opinion, guilt is contagious. The clean, energetic image of Leroy Johnson was suddenly stained by the gritty reality of heroin trafficking. Gene stood by his mother. He sat in every court hearing. He paid the lawyers. He refused to abandon her. But the shame was eating him alive. He walked into the studio the next day, and the whispers were deafening. The producers looked at him differently. The advertisers got nervous. Gene realized a terrifying truth. He could dance his way out of poverty, But he couldn't dance his way out of his D. He tried to fix it the only way he knew how, with money. He decided to move his family out of the danger zone. He bought a beautiful home in a quiet, predominantly white neighborhood in New York. He wanted to give them peace. He wanted to give them a fresh start. But he underestimated the hate that was waiting for them. Shortly after buying the house, tragedy struck again. But this wasn't the police. This was the neighbors. The house was torched. It wasn't an electrical fire. It was arson. The smell of gasoline was unmistakable when the firefighters arrived. Gene Anthony Ray, the boy who made the whole world cheer, stood in the ashes of his dream house. He had tried to do the right thing. He had tried to buy his way into safety. And the message from the neighborhood was clear. You don't belong here. It broke him. Imagine the psychological fracture. On TV, he was a beloved idol. White teenagers had posters of him on their walls. But in real life, his house was being burned down because of the color of his skin and the reputation of his family. The cognitive dissonance was too much to bear. Gene stopped caring. If the world was going to treat him like a thug, why bother trying to be an angel? The discipline he had fought so hard to maintain began to crumble. The drinking got heavier. The partying got darker. He wasn't partying to celebrate anymore. He was partying to forget the smell of smoke and the sight of his mother in handcuffs. He started missing rehearsals. He started screaming at directors. He started showing up to set with eyes that were glassy and distant. The spiral had begun, and Hollywood, notorious for its lack of patience, was already looking at its watch. The boy who detonated into fame was now beginning to self-destruct. In Hollywood, there is a golden rule. You can be difficult if you are successful. But the moment the ratings drop, your demons are no longer eccentricities. They are liabilities. By 1984, Gene Anthony Ray was becoming a liability. The psychological blows of the drug bust and the arson had shattered his focus. He wasn't just partying anymore. He was self-medicating. He was drinking to numb the rage. On set, the professionalism evaporated. He missed rehearsals. When he did show up, he was often hungover or belligerent. He stopped training. The chiseled electric physique of Leroy Johnson began to soften. He gained weight. The sharpness in his movements, that lightning-fast precision, began to dull. The producers gave him warnings. They suspended him. A warning shot across the bow. But Gene didn't hear it. Or maybe he heard it and simply didn't care anymore. If the world was going to burn his house down, what did a TV show matter? Then came the final blow. He was fired. It wasn't a mutual decision. It wasn't a creative difference. It was an eviction. He was removed from the show he helped build. He was cut from the role he created. When the news broke, it didn't just hurt his bank account. It destroyed his identity. For 5 years, Gene Anthony Ray was Leroy Johnson. Without Leroy, who was he? Just a kid from Harlem, with a criminal record in his family and a bad reputation in the industry. After the firing, the silence was deafening. The phone that used to ring non-stop with offers suddenly went dead. The friends who drank his champagne disappeared. He locked himself inside his apartment. He ate junk food for months. He stopped dancing. He looked in the mirror one day and didn't recognize the man staring back. Not the body, not the eyes, not the spirit. Desperate to escape the shame, he ran. He didn't run back to Harlem. He ran to the only place where people still treated him like a god. In Milan and Rome, the obsession with fame was still alive. Gene moved there, hoping to find a time machine. He wanted to go back to 1982. And for a moment it seemed to work. He appeared on Italian variety shows. He opened a dance school. He was surrounded by fans again. But it was a hollow victory. He was chasing a ghost. He was trying to perform the old moves with a body that was breaking down. There are painful clips from this era, Gene appearing on European TV, trying to summon the old fire, but looking exhausted, sweaty, and lost. He was performing a caricature of himself, and underneath the sequins and the forced smiles, a new invisible enemy was taking root in his blood. He wasn't just fighting addiction anymore. He was fighting a virus, and unlike the critics or the producers, this enemy could not be charmed, and it could not be outdanced. The boy who detonated was now slowly burning out. Italy was a bandage, not a cure. Eventually the money ran out, the gigs dried up, and Gene Anthony Ray had to come home. But he didn't come home to a mansion in the hills. He didn't come home to a welcoming committee. He returned to New York, and the descent was absolute. The millions he had earned gone, given to family spent on addiction, burned in the fire of his chaotic life. There were reports of him sleeping on friends' couches, scrambling for money, trying to start a dance company that never got off the ground. The boy who once had 2 secretaries just to open his fan mail was now practically anonymous. And then, the final shadow fell over him. In the mid-90s, Gene's health began to collapse. At first, people whispered it was just the drugs. But it was something deeper, something that was decimating an entire generation of artists, dancers, and dreamers. HIV. In 2003, the stigma around HIV and AIDS was still a heavy, suffocating blanket, especially in the Black community. It was the silent killer, not just because of what it did to the body, but because of what it did to the conversation. People didn't talk about it. They hid it. Gene hid it too. He didn't want pity. He didn't want to be the tragic cautionary tale. He wanted to be Leroy Johnson. He wanted to be immortal. But the virus is relentless. It weakened his immune system. It stripped away his strength. The legs that once leaped over taxicabs could barely carry him across a room. In November 2003, Gene suffered a stroke. His body, battered by years of addiction and compromised by the virus, simply gave up. He was rushed to the hospital. He lingered for a few weeks, fighting one last battle. On November 14, 2003, Gene Anthony Ray took his final breath. He was 41 years old. The reaction from the world was a strange mix of shock and silence. For a moment, the news cycle remembered him. Oh, the fame guy died. They played the clips. They showed the dancing. But then the questions started. How, why he was so young. The media focused on the stroke. They focused on the hard living. But few dared to talk about the systemic abandonment that led him there. He didn't die surrounded by the Hollywood elite. He didn't have a star-studded funeral televised to millions. He died leaving behind a family that was still struggling and a legacy that was already beginning to fade. The irony is crushing. The boy who sang "Baby, Look at Me and Tell Me What You See," you ain't seen the best of me yet. We had seen the best of him, and we let it burn out. Gene Anthony Ray left this world too soon. But look around you. He never really left. Every time you see a kid dancing on a subway platform in New York, turning a commute into a performance, that's Gene. Every time you watch a movie like Step Up or Stomp the Yard, where street-style battles against classical training, that's the war Gene Anthony Ray started. Every time a black boy refuses to shrink himself, refuses to soften his edge just to fit into a polite space. That is the spirit of Leroy Johnson. He was the blueprint. Before social media made dance viral, Gene Anthony Ray proved that you didn't need a degree to be a genius. You didn't need a studio with mirrors. You just needed a beat and the courage to detonate. He taught a generation of kids, especially black and brown kids from forgotten neighborhoods, that their bodies were instruments of power. He showed them that street wasn't a dirty word. It was an art form. Yes, his story is tragic. Yes, the system failed him. Hollywood used his fire to warm itself, and then left him out in the cold. But tragedy doesn't erase impact. If anything, it makes the lesson clearer. Talent is precious. It needs to be protected. It needs to be nurtured, not just consumed. So how do we remember him? Don't remember him as the victim of the 80s. Remember him as the storm. Remember him as the unpolished, undeniable, unstoppable force who looked into the camera and promised he would live forever. And in a way, he kept that promise, because as long as there is a kid somewhere in Harlem or London or Tokyo moving to a rhythm that no one else can hear, Jean Anthony Ray is still dancing. Did Jean Anthony Ray inspire you to dance? Do you remember watching Fame? Let us know in the comments below. And if you believe that true legends should never be forgotten, hit that like button and share this video. We are on a mission to tell the stories that Hollywood tries to hide. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. Keep moving.